The changing of names, the spoofing of AIS, the falsifying of documents, this isn't unusual at all. This has now become routine dark fleet behavior.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
The deepening ties between China, Russia and North Korea would certainly have some in Washington concerned.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
The IDF will continue to uphold the ceasefire agreement and will respond firmly to any violation of it.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battle Lines. It's Friday, the 9th of January 2025, and it's been a dramatic week in international affairs. On Wednesday afternoon, US forces flying out of Britain took control of a rusty oil tanker somewhere in the frigid waters between northern Scotland and Iceland. The Bella 1, which had changed its name and its flag to one of Russia while underway, had been chased all the way from the Caribbean off the Venezuelan coast. It was the culmination of a dramatic maritime chase. It sparked a confrontation between Russia and the United States, and it raised all kinds of questions about what was on board and what it means for the future of international maritime law. To discuss all this, we've turned to Tom Sharpe, the former Royal Navy commander and a friend of the Battle Lines podcast. Tom, welcome to Battle Lines once again. We've had, I think, at least 2 tankers intercepted now. One in the Caribbean, which seems to have been carrying oil. One in the North Atlantic, somewhere between Scotland and Iceland, which apparently was not carrying oil. Could you just give us a sense of what you think has happened here?
If you package all these events together, including the raid in Venezuela, this is all part of the same drive by the US to reassert itself on the business of controlling oil, not necessarily owning oil, but controlling it and controlling the currency that provides it. This is all connected, and it's all sort of a re-emergence of the Monroe Doctrine that their security strategy made clear that they were now going to pursue. So you can connect the dots and call all these things roughly the same thing. The one that happened yesterday in the Greenland Iceland UK gap has many interesting nuances to it, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But the base premise of this is controlling oil, the flow of oil, and particularly that involved with Venezuela, Iran, China, and now Russia.
Can we talk a bit about the MV Bella 1, as it was, which changed its name? This is extraordinary, I think, because it was quite a chase. It's been chased all the way across the Atlantic, pretty much. Why do you think it took so long? And what do we know actually about this eventual boarding in really frigid, difficult waters in the high seas of the Atlantic?
I think a little bit of backstory on the ship. It had been at sea for months. It had come from the Gulf of Aden. It had gone through the Suez. This had been months in the building, and all the while it was Bella 1. It's presumed it was due alongside in Venezuela to embark oil that was then going to Iran. That's the assumption. So this was of interest under the new Monroe Doctrine and all the sort of principles that we've just set out. This vessel was of interest and was there when the sort of ramp up in pressure, the board and seas started to pick up pace off Venezuela. The changing of names, the spoofing of AIS, the falsifying of documents, this isn't unusual at all. This has now become routine dark fleet behavior. There was nothing in the way this ship was behaving prior to this that made it particularly stand out. Nevertheless, the US wanted to board it, and they had permission to do so. They had legal permission to do so back end of last year. Why they didn't get on board off Venezuela is not clear, but it is important to this whole story. The working theory I've got, based on what I've heard and piecing it together based on my experience of boarding operations, was that they closed it to do what we would call either a compliant or a non-compliant boarding. Compliant is obvious. Non-compliant is where they take measures to make it difficult for you to get on board. They don't answer the radio. They don't put out ladders. They weave. This ship's not going to weave. It's too big. Fire hoses, for example. So they're essentially trying to make it difficult for you to get on board. And that requires a certain classification of boarding team to be able to do. Fine. I think the working assumption was that it was going to be one of those two things. As they approached it, it became what we would call an opposed boarding, i.e. they could well shoot back. In UK doctrine, that immediately takes that boarding out of regular forces' hands and puts it, there are special Royal Marine teams that can do it, and of course the special forces. So it may well be that that's what happened here. This thing escalated and they lost the risk permissions, the rules of engagement to get on board. And now, of course, it's gone. There's multiple ships, there's multiple priorities. There's nothing specifically in this one that goes, this is the one you must get on board. But it's escaped and it's evading and it's now plodding northeast, the slowest car chase ever with a US Coast Guard cutter in company. So why does it then take so long to get on board? Meanwhile, of course, whilst it's crossing the Atlantic, it goes dark on AIS, switch is off its transponder, and goes through this extraordinary charade of registering and painting flags on its side to make it look Russian, which, as an aside, grants you zero legal added protection. You cannot do that underway. If you were a valid boarding target, you remain one no matter what you drape over the side. So off she went at slow speed, or reasonable speed for a ship of that size, followed by the Coast Guard cutter. And there would have been an assumption, this is why I think my theory about it being possibly opposed, that they needed to wait until they were close enough to land to bring into play other forces to coerce it into becoming a compliant boarding again. And that, I think, is what played out 2 nights ago. It got to the Greenland Iceland UK gap. We saw the movement of US aircraft and RAF aircraft that all gave indications that things were moving. And those US aircraft were very specific in their nature, very special forces orientated. So to me, there was a clear messaging point here. You become compliant or look what's coming. So that might have been real. It might have been a bluff. I don't know, but it clearly worked. And what happened next, we saw the ship alter course, and then a single helicopter, a Little Bird helicopter, then carried out the boarding. So it went from what looked like a sort of brewing special forces, long range, rotary wing over those sort of ranges would have been very spicy in terms of planning and refueling, strong sea states, high winds, quite lively, to what actually then turned into a sort of routine, albeit at long range and in bad weather, single helicopter boarding. So fascinating. That's why I think it took so long. I think they needed to wait to get close enough to land for the bluff to be credible.
You've been active on your Twitter, raising all kinds of questions about what this means, about the rules of the sea, and also particularly for Britain. Britain was the staging post for this American operation. The RAF took part in it. The government, I think, has put out a statement openly saying we were involved in this seizure of what is, I suppose, officially a Russian ship now. If this is the new kind of status quo, or how the Americans, and maybe we are going to act on the high seas, how does that change things compared to how they have been done in the past?
It's a really interesting question, and I'm very intrigued to see how this plays out. We've seen the Secretary of State talking about increasing measures. What does that actually mean in practice? Because I don't think we would have boarded that vessel on our own. Had that, that set of conditions, had that ship been coming past us, I don't think we would have boarded it on our own, because so far we haven't. We're one of the few countries actually that hasn't interdicted a dark fleet ship and seized it, or at least boarded it and detained it. Whereas Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, France, at various stages, they've all leapt on board and gone, come this way, sir. And then let it go for various reasons. That some of that have been dark fleet, some of that's been undersea infrastructure, and so on. We haven't. We've been quite backward leaning. And when you have conversations with our lawyers, they can be frustrating. The conversation's frustrating because you're talking about their ability to operate in this legal grey zone and our inability to counter in that same grey zone. Our adherence to rules, to the strict rules, make us almost sort of fighting with one hand.
What are these rules, and why is it a grey zone? Can you just kind of explain it to us?
Because UNCLOS was written by lawyers for lawyers, right? It gives you reasons why you can board on the high seas, but they're open to interpretation as everything is. So you can, various articles, UNCLOS 110, for example, is the one that's often cited. There are 4 reasons why you can, and stateless, verifying the state of a vessel is one of them. But we historically have gone, well, if they tell us they're from this state, or they provide this insurance document that says they're from this flag, then we'll let them be on their way. There is a grey zone. There's an area for interpretation here. We, so far, through the sanctioned shipping business, particularly Russian sanctioned shipping business have been quite backward leaning on. We've applied sanctions liberally to people, to ships, to companies, but we've never interdicted anyone at sea because we think they're either uninsured or they're moving dark. Like I say, there's a grey zone. And the US has lent into this much more aggressively, I suppose, as you'd expect. So it was interesting that we then supported that because, like I say, I don't think we would have necessarily boarded that vessel if left to our own devices. I think we had to support it. I think it would have been absolute suicide to not do so. And also, I think it was right. It was right anyway. I think we should be taking a tougher stance on these vessels. We should be imposing a cost back on Russia and the oil that's funding his war machine. I think we should be stepping this up. And the Secretary of State just said we will, and we just facilitated a country that is. So yeah, what next, UK? Needless to say, there are plenty of people who think completely the opposite way and think this whole thing was a crime. So this politically has a way to go.
Well, the Russians say that, obviously. The Russians say this was a Russian ship. It was flying our flag. It had Russian citizens on board. I assume they were crew members, but we don't actually know if there were some other Russians on board. Who knows? What kind of recourse do the Russians or other states who flag nations of ships that are interdicted have? And does this create, I don't know, legal risk? What would the legal risk be for Britain, I suppose, in this case?
Well, the legal risk is that it ends up in an international court and you get found guilty of piracy or something like that. But, you know, the Hague have accused China of this sort of thing for decades now, and China go, yeah, so what? Or we don't recognize that ruling. So, I mean, this is the murkiness of international law. It only holds up if people agree to hold it up. If a state goes, do you know what, I'm not going to do that, and you can't legally enforce it and you can't militarily enforce it, that of course is key here, then it's meaningless. I mean, I personally don't think it is meaningless. I think take these laws away and you end up with the sort of chaos that preceded them and led to them being put in place in the first instance. So I think that you have to adhere to an extent to these rules, but you also have to exploit the zone, the grey zone, as well as you can. So in this case, this situation is not over, I don't think. If Russian surface vessels do now close on it, I don't know where it is, by the way. I'm assuming it's being directed towards the northwest coast of Scotland, but I could be entirely wrong in that. No one knows. If they want to thoroughly search it, they might need to even take it alongside somewhere. So there are all these options available. And certainly one option is to get off now and say, we boarded it, we didn't find anything, honours even, be on your way, and everything just stops and that's the end of it. That is an option. So let's see how this plays out. But if it keeps coming towards the UK and the Russians really want to up it and start sending armed surface warships our way, then we're in a bit of a situation again, and this will not go away quickly.
Do you have any suspicions that this may not have been simply an empty oil tanker, given the interest that's been shown in it by the United States, Britain, and Russia?
There's two options here. It had something really juicy in it. I don't know what that would be. What was it that was in that ship all the way for months, all the way from the Gulf of Aden, through that long journey that was... I don't know. Needless to say, there are conspiracies abounding. But that's option one. There was something really fruity in there. But if that's the case, then why didn't they board it off Venezuela? If that was really an urgent boarding priority, then okay, you send your military and you send your special forces in and you get on board. I think more likely is they just missed it. And then it became I call it a rage chase. Just get that ship. Because egos have been dented now. And before you know it, this has developed into something, it's grown arms and legs, and you've got special forces moving around in someone else's country. It's perfectly possible. That's what led to this. And, in some ways, it's the simplest answer, which is, in my view, quite often the best.
I was wondering if you had any views on the fact that the Russians initially sent a submarine, and there was some disparaging commentary along the lines of, that's not going to be much use here. What does it say to you, that choice of vessel?
Yeah, it's exactly no use. You almost couldn't send anything worse. If you really wanted to stop that boarding, then you're sending some Admiral Gorshkov frigates at 30 knots round the top, heading southwest at max chat to get in the way, to stand 100 yards either side of the vessel. That would change the calculus. Of course it would. An SSN, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, is short of escalating to war, it is of no use whatsoever. If it was even there, which of course is a question, it certainly focused a few people's minds. But I mean, again, an SSN tracking that southwest at high speed is really going to offer itself up for an awful lot of counter detection opportunities that would benefit us. And as I say, not them. The whole thing smacks to me of not having enough ships, of Putin not having enough surface ships to do this properly. So it's a little bit desperate. And had it even been there, pretty useless.
It's difficult to disentangle this from all the other things that have been going on in the world this week. It's been chased from Venezuela, but it came from Iran. We all know what's happening in Iran at the moment. Really big questions there. And it's bordered, of course, as you say, in the Greenland Iceland UK gap, just as we're having all kinds of discussions about what are America's intentions towards Greenland. The other interview on this podcast is Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the former US Army general, who we spoke to a little bit about that question. Any views on the significance of that and what's going on in the North Atlantic as a result, perhaps, of this new Monroe Doctrine?
Yeah, the timing is agonizingly ironic, isn't it? You're all pointless to us. You're all useless. You add no value. You're a leech on our resources. Rhetoric reaches a crescendo that starts to talk about invading a NATO ally, which, by the way, I think is complete nonsense. I think it's part of the negotiation so that when it backs down into something sensible, we all breathe a huge sigh of relief. But here we are. That's the language being used at the exact same moment that they need us to conduct a boarding at long range. There's a grim irony to it. On almost the same day, they're conducting an operation which without us would have been very, very much more difficult and very, very much more dangerous. It's almost extraordinary that we need to say this, but it brings home the power of alliances that are based on trust and understanding and mutual respect, which we had for so long. It's extraordinary that we still need to say that because, it's self-evident that alliances like this make everyone stronger, including the strongest member. And I suppose this operation, the timing of it happening when it did is part of that messaging back. And the Prime Minister was able to then get on the phone and to the President and talk about Greenland brings the sequencing and the timing of all this together, as quite often the maritime environment tends to do.
As part of all this, we did see a very large and quite sudden buildup of American military assets in their bases in the UK, apparently connected with Bella 1 and the boarding operation. But there has also been speculation that perhaps they're preparing for something else. Any views on that and what is going on, given Donald Trump's appetite this new year for spectacular operations overseas?
I was tracking the return of those US aircraft to Fairford and Mildenhall reasonably closely. And it was a return. Until I know the exact numbers, I can't say for certain, but it very much looked to me like those assets returning post-Venezuela. So they're based there anyway. All those special forces, helicopters, those wide-body jets, they're based there anyway as part of the ongoing forward deployment of them. They're critical forward bases to the US, and these were aircraft coming back. It was remarkable how quickly after the Venezuela operation they were returning. That, to me, felt like messaging at the time. We're done here. We're moving on. Of course, now it's obvious that there was more to it. And they were definitely part of this build-up. You saw them egressing north. And then there were videos of Ospreys conducting fast roping exercises. I mean, this was part of the messaging, part of the comply or this is coming next. So it's definitely all connected. What happens next? Well, largely, I think, depends on what happens to the ship next. Does this carry on being a special forces type operation? Does it revert to being a constabulary one, or does it become customs? And I don't know. So I don't know where those jets and aircraft will go over the next few days. And then what the master plan is for them, whether that's a major exercise that's brewing in Germany or something in Iran, I don't know. I would be speculating. But I think it's important to say that, as far as I can tell, most of those aircraft belonged in those bases anyway, and they were coming back. It turns out they were going back very quickly to get involved in the boarding of the vessel. So yeah, there's, again, the aircraft spotting industry will be all over this, and we'll start tracking it particularly. But they do some of them confuse regular exercise and regular routine flying activity with mass military build-up. So you do have to treat those reports initially with a little degree of caution, but by and large, they're very quick and very accurate. So let's see.
That was the former Royal Navy Commander Tom Sharpe. That's all for this edition of Battle Lines. As I said at the top of the podcast, things have been moving very quickly in international affairs this week. We'll be back on Monday with our usual Start the Week episode. Until then, that was Battle Lines. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and Venetia Rainey. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others to find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin, and the executive producer is Louisa Wells.